Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Fellow Toastmasters. Today I'll be reading from a book called Boy, Tales of Childhood by Roald Dahl, author of Big Friendly Giant, Witches. I'm sure you're familiar with Roald Dahl. And this story is set in 1920s area. So he started reading and writing at a young age, and so he has a lot of artifacts to reference. So I'm just going to read a quick passage here, but before I do, I wanted to give you a little bit of background. He's from Northern Europe, so I think might be Holland or something like that. They're on boats as much as they are traveling by cart or walking, so up there. And recently, we're in the age of 9 to 12, so he's at a boarding school, and he's talking about his experiences there. So this chapter is entitled The Matron. At St. Peter's, the ground floor was all classrooms. The first floor was all dormitories. On the dormitory floor, the matron ruled supreme. This was her territory. Hers was the only voice of authority up here, and given the 11 and 12-year-old boys were terrified of this female ogre, for she ruled with a rod of steel. The matron was a large, fair-haired woman with a bosom. Her age was probably no more than 28, but it made no difference whether she was 28 or 68, because to us, a grown-up was a grown-up, and all grown-ups were dangerous creatures at this school. Once you had climbed to the top of the stairs and set foot on the dormitory floor, you were in the matron's power, and the source of this power was the unseen but frightening figure of the headmaster lurking down in the depths of his study below. At any time she liked, the matron could send you down in your pajamas and dressing gown to report to this merciless giant. And when this happened, you got caned on the spot. The matron knew this, and she relished in the whole business. She could move along the corridor like lightning, and when you least expected it, her head and her bosom would come popping through the dormitory doorway. "Who threw that sponge?" the dreaded voice would call out. "It was you, Perkins, was it not? Don't lie to me, Perkins. Don't argue with me. I know perfectly well it was you. Now you can put your dressing gown on and go downstairs and report to the headmaster this instant." In slow motion, with immense reluctance, little Perkins, aged 8 and a half, would get into his dressing gown and slippers and disappear down the long corridor that led to the back stairs and the headmaster's private quarters. And the matron, as we all knew, would follow after him and stand at the top of the stairs, listening with a funny look on her face for the crack, crack, crack of that cane that would soon be coming up from below. To me, that noise always sounded as though the headmaster was firing a pistol at the ceiling of his study. Looking back on it now, there seems little doubt that the matron disliked small boys very much indeed. She never smiled at us or said anything nice. And when, for example, the lint stuck to the cut of your kneecap, you were not allowed to take it off bit by bit so that it didn't hurt. She would always whip it off with a flourish, muttering, "Don't be such a ridiculous little boy." He's got some writings here from when he was young, and so he wrote, "We've got a new matron," he's writing to his mom. "Last term, one night, in the washing room, having inspected a boy called Ford, she kissed him," and it cuts off there. So now he explains. "On one occasion during the first term, I went down to the matron's room to have some iodine put on a grazed knee, and I didn't know you had to knock before you entered. I opened the door and walked right in, and there she was in the center of the sick room floor, locked in some kind of embrace with the Latin master, Mr. Victor Corrado. They flew apart as I entered, and both their faces went suddenly crimson. 'How dare you come in without knocking?' the matron shouted. 'Here I am trying to get something out of Mr. Corrado's eye, and in you burst and disturb the whole delicate operation. I'm very sorry, matron. Go away and come back in 5 minutes,' she cried. I shot out of the room like a bullet." After lights out, the matron would prowl the corridor like a panther, trying to catch a sound of a whisper behind the door, and we soon learned that her powers of hearing were so phenomenal that it was safer to keep quiet. Once, after lights out, a brave boy called Rag, tiptoed out of the dormitory and sprinkled castor sugar all over the linoleum floor of the corridor. When Rag returned and told us that the corridor had been successfully sugared from one end to the other, I began shivering with excitement. I lay there in the dark in my bed, waiting and waiting for the matron to go on the prowl. Nothing happened. Perhaps, I told myself, she is in her room taking another look in Mr. Victor Corrado's eye. Suddenly, from far down the corridor came a resounding crunch. Crunch, crunch, crunch went the footsteps. It sounded as though a giant was walking on loose gravel. Then we heard the high-pitched, furious voice of the matron in the distance. "Who did this?" she was shrieking. "How dare you do this?" She went crunching along the corridor, flinging open all the doors and switching on all the lights. The intensity of her fury was frightening. "Come along," she cried out, marching with crunching steps up and down the corridor. "Own up. I want the name of this filthy little boy who put down the sugar. Own up immediately. Step forward and confess." "Don't own up," we whispered to Rag. "We won't give you away." Rag kept quiet, and I didn't blame him for that. Had he owned up, his fate certainly would have been a bloody, terrible one. Soon the headmaster was summoned from below. The matron, with the steam coming out of her nostril, cried out for him to help, and now the whole school was herded into the long corridor, where we stood freezing in our pajamas and bare feet. Nobody stepped forward. I could see the headmaster was getting very angry indeed. "Very well," he thundered. "Every one of you will go out at once and get the key from his tuck box." It's a little box they kept all their stuff in. "Hand the keys to the matron, who will keep them for the rest of the term, and all parcels coming from home will be confiscated from now on. I will not tolerate this kind of behavior." We handed in our keys, and throughout the remaining 6 weeks of the term, we went very hungry. But all through those 6 weeks, Arkell, my friend, continued to feed his frog with slugs through the hole in the lid of his tuck box. Using an old teapot, he also poured water in through the hole every day to keep the creature moist and happy. I admired Arkell very much for looking after his frog so well. Although he himself was famished, he refused to let his frog go hungry. Ever since then, I have tried to be kind to small animals.